Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Through the Briars podcast. This is your host, Christian Kosovas. We're here today with episode 7. And for episode 7, I want to talk about 7 books for episode 7 that I think are absolutely life-changing and every single person should read at least one time in their life. Because most people go their entire lives without reading books that actually change how they understand life. Not books that just entertain, but books that reveal something terrifying and beautiful about human nature. I think 7 is also a really good number as well, because 7 is quite a symbolic number. It represents things like the 7 virtues or the 7 deadly sins. There's a lot of symbolism in the number 7, and also because it is episode 7, so I thought it was very fitting. So what I want to go through with these 7 books is give you a brief overview of what they're trying to get at human nature-wise, psychologically, philosophically, literarily. And I want to explain to you how these great works of literature, that their quality is one to none, how they explore the timeless human struggles, and why we can't navigate our life now is because we don't have the tools necessary to deal with that struggling. And I believe that these books hide and conceal those tools and the solutions deep in the text. All the things that we deal with all the time: morality, temptation, ambition, vanity, meaning, the problem of evil, acting good, responsibility, sacrifice. All these books I'm going to cover, I believe they will cover all of these dimensions. And if you can read all of them, I believe you'll have a very strong compass for being afterwards. And these 7 books, when I read them, they were, some of them, quite difficult, but they profoundly shaped the way I understand human nature, and they really bolstered. I had a pretty good compass as it was initially, but these 7 books really challenged me to challenge that compass, even though I thought it was right, and helped me learn a lot more and brought questions to my mind and mental debates inside myself that I never thought I would have. It really challenged me to question my own beliefs and to bolster them alongside this literature and this art, but also to not sit there and be and not abide to what I've been fed, but to really think for myself and to come to that conclusion of, yes, I'm still going to believe what I believe. And these texts help bolster that, or these texts help to reveal something to me that I wasn't so aware of before. So the first book that I have for you guys is The Divine Comedy by Dante Alighieri. Now, this is going to cover this book for the sake of human nature in the world and how it's going to help you in your life. This is going to help you with the structure of the moral universe. Okay, so the Divine Comedy is 3 books in one, 3 separate books, and it is composed of the Inferno, Purgatorio, and Paradiso, which all of those are Italian, and they all translate to hell, the Inferno, Purgatorio, and Paradiso is paradise or heaven. Now, essentially what the summary of the book is, for each book, I'm going to give a brief summary, and I'm going to try keep it spoiler free as best I can, but no promises. So you've been warned. But there's still so much depth despite the main plot line that is in these books. But for this one specifically, I think out of the 3, the first book, Inferno, is the best one. And that's not to discredit the others. The other 2 are amazing, and I still think you should read all 3. But there is something about the first one, Inferno, which is so gravitating and immersive. Basically, Dante is known, he's known very well, and he is one of the first literary authors that he does lots of self-insert fiction. So he places himself in the book as the main character, which I think is quite funny. So the poet Dante has these books, the Divine Comedy. It's composed in a poetry sort of way. So the poet Dante becomes lost in a dark forest and begins his journey through the afterlife. And he's guided by this other Roman poet, Virgil. So Virgil is his spiritual guide. Okay. Now he begins his journey in hell, and then he goes to purgatory, and then later he is guided towards heaven. So each realm, each one of the cosmic realms reveals the consequences of human choice, the good and the bad consequences. Now, when Dante enters hell, the way that Dante himself describes it is, I would say, not. Now, he may have believed it in a literal sense. I don't think I believe it this way in a literal sense. I believe it has enduring truths, but I think that the 9 layers of hell that Dante speaks about, I think it's more of a psychological topography of hell. And it's much more useful to the individual as a psychological model than as a, yes, this is concrete, real. And basically, what Virgil is trying to show Dante throughout the journey is that the deeper he goes and to the lower circles of hells he goes to, he is progressively getting closer and closer to the root of all evil. And at each layer, he explains how the sinners are being punished for the specific sin that they've committed. And he also says certain people and real life figures that he believes are there. Now, whether that's true or not, it's not a relevant question as far as I'm concerned. Who's in what place? It's not for us to decide. But I think a lot of it's quite funny as well. So I'm going to outline just a few of the circles of hell and some of their punishments so you guys can get a bit of an idea, because it's very grueling and it's quite ghastly. And if you're somebody who can be creeped out quite easily or doesn't handle gore the best, some of these are quite graphic and the descriptions are very, very unsettling in some of the circles. But just for some important ones, one of the circles, this one is quite low. I believe it's the 7th circle. So there's 9 circles, and I believe this is the 7th one. And this is violence against others. In that circle, there is 3 other mini circles, 3 areas for the 3 different types of people who commit 3 different types of violence. So the first one is violence against others, which is where the tyrants and the murderers belong. Now, their punishment for their sin is they boil in a river of blood that is guarded by mythological creatures. And these mythological creatures, they have to keep pushing the sinners in to the boiling river of blood so that they can't get out. And the meaning behind that is they shed blood in life, so now they are bathing in the blood of the ones that they murdered. The second one is the violence against the self, which is suicides. And their punishment, the punishment for the people who commit suicides, is they are transformed into this twisted sort of tree where them and the tree is merged as one. And harpies come along and they tear off their branches, which causes them immense pain because, again, the tree and them are basically one. And they regrow and the harpies come back and they pick it and they scratch at the person's face. And the meaning behind that is that these people, they rejected their own bodies. They rejected the spirit of transformation entirely, so they cannot possess their own bodies again, and they become subject to the wrath of the harpies. Now, the third violent circle in the violent circle is violence against God, nature, and art. So this includes people mostly who are blasphemers. And blasphemers in multiple senses, not just the one, but the punishment is they wander across a burning desert with fire raining from the sky. And what that symbolizes, I mean, it's a pretty sad and lonely existence, but what that's supposed to symbolize is their defiance of divine order creates a barren spiritual landscape for all eternity, suffering from the fire of God in a sense, not of God, but in rejecting the divine order, the love and the fire of God now instead, it burns them instead of warming them. And they experience, because of their blasphemy and their rejection of the divine order, they experience the love of God as painful rather than comfort. The next circle that I want to talk about is fraud. This one is also very low. I believe this one's after the violence. And this has places of people who were sorcerers and corrupt clergy and corrupt politicians. And essentially, just to quickly run through that, the sorcerers and the witches, they had their heads turned backwards, just kind of creepy. The corrupt clergy, their heads were buried in rocks while their feet would burn. So they would experience that eternal agony for the eternal deception. And the corrupt politicians were submerged in boiling tar, which I think it's a very interesting one with fitting because deceiving the masses and having such a cold-hearted, black and dark soul should be the equivalent of it's symbolically equivalent to that boiling tar where they're boiling in a pit of black pain. The last one, which I think is the most important, is treachery and betrayal. So this is the ninth circle of hell. Dante says that this is the root all evil, which I believe is truth. And despite if it's an actual physical circle, spiritual circle or not, I think the premise and the eternal truth of it is right, is that the punishment for those who are in the circle of betrayal is that they are frozen in a lake of ice, some worse than others. It depends on the level of betrayal and what kind of betrayal they've committed, but they're frozen because betrayal is the coldest and most calculated sin. Betrayal is the betrayal of the spirit of transformation itself. And when you betray the spirit of transformation, you're betraying yourself as a person. You don't allow yourself to grow. And in that stems to pride and ego. I think that can't be more true. And it really, when I went through each layer and I was reading, apart from, it's a very difficult book to read and it's really hard to understand. There's a lot of mythological symbolism in this book and it can be really hard. You got to take a lot of time to read slowly and you can look at analysis to help you. But each layer talks essentially about the 7 layers of hell. Like the heretics, for example, people who don't believe that the soul was immortal, their punishment is that they are cast into a tomb with body and soul because they didn't believe the soul was immortal. So now, as they were buried on earth in a tomb, so now are they buried in hell in a tomb that is on fire and they're constantly burning and trapped for all eternity, that would be absolutely terrifying in my opinion. But really the premise of the Divine Comedy is it's an allegory of the human soul's journey. It tells you the consequence of sin and it also tells you the consequence of redemption and the cleansing, which is mostly the part of the purgatory where they spend time atoning for the sins they've committed and suffering, but it's not the complete rejection of transcendence itself to where they're in hell suffering permanently and eternally. And then heaven is obviously, well, here's how you probably should orient your life and the sort of virtues you should be chasing after. But I do think the hell portion, the first book of the 3, is the most beneficial. It really challenges you and tells you why living in each way with each kind of sin will distort your vision for virtue and your climb for redemption. So in Dante's vision, essentially, hell is not a random punishment because each soul inhabits a reality shaped by its own sin. The angry drown in rage, the greedy struggle under burdens they never asked for, and the betrayers freeze in the cold isolation of treachery. By the way, in the ninth circle, Dante says that Satan himself is there, which also represents because he was the first one who betrayed God, but also because he is not the ruler of hell, but he is suffering greatly in the lowest circle as well. The themes of this book are, like we were just talking about, that divine justice, sin and punishment, spiritual transformation, redemption, virtue. It's so rich. And I believe that everyone should at least read the first one, The Inferno. Just prepare yourself so you can have a little bit of an iron stomach because I'm leaving out a lot of details on the punishments of these things deliberately because they're quite gruesome in nature. And this book is supposed to represent the archetype because you guys know that I love to talk about this kind of thing. Is the archetype is it's the spiritual journey. It's the simplest way to put it. The spiritual journey through suffering, evil, and good and virtue. There's a good quote in the first book in Inferno where it says, "Abandon all hope, ye who enter here." And that just, that explains there that the punishment in hell reflects the nature of sin itself. You end up in hell and, well, there is no hope for you, essentially. You're stuck there now. Freaky. It's really freaky in how compelling of a force it is that even Dante making up this topography of hell, although it's not taken in the literal sense, just the psychological profundity of it, it's mind-boggling, to say the least. Mind-boggling. Now, the second book that I want to talk about, another favorite of mine, is The Master and the Margarita by Mikhail Bulgakov. So what this represents as a path for life and a thing to remember is essentially the devil on earth and a blinded society that is now desensitized to darkness and is willfully ignorant towards it. Now, as we know, Dostoevsky is the goat of Russian literature. And I would say this novel here, it is on the level of Dostoevsky. It is an absolutely profound read, and it is so rich. Again, has lots of symbolism, but the plot overview of The Master and the Margarita is a mysterious stranger arrives in Soviet Moscow with a strange group of supernatural companions. And eventually he is revealed to be the devil, this man that enters Moscow. And accompanying him, he has Behemoth, who is a very tall, big, bulky cat that walks on 2 feet and speaks cryptically in riddles and loves vodka, which I think is hilarious because it doesn't really get much more Russian than that, which is a talking cat that loves vodka. I just thought that was quite funny. And he's accompanied also by an assassin and a vampire, essentially. And that is the devil's entourage that enters Soviet Moscow. And through many bizarre and chaotic events, this entourage, they expose the hypocrisy, corruption, and the dishonesty of the society and where they're at. And the second storyline towards that is it follows a persecuted writer who's persecuted by the public and the authorities. And he's known as the master and his devoted lover, Margarita. This has a lot of reference to the biblical corpus and Jesus Christ of the Old Testament, and it's very rich. And essentially, I think the importance of that, the themes, is just the truth versus propaganda and what we're being fed and how we're being deceived, and good and evil and the spiritual reality hidden in a material world that a lot of people are very ignorantly blind to. Now, it's interesting because the devil is inherently evil, but for the sake of this book specifically, now I'm going to preface it by saying it's not painting him as a good guy because he's not, but he is taking advantage of the human's ignorance, and he's convinced the world that he doesn't exist. And he is now playing the trickster, exposing truth. And these people are so blind that they can't see it. They're so enveloped by evil in the material world that there is nothing that they can do. One part towards the beginning of the book, the devil, he does a magic show, and essentially he cuts off the head of somebody. And the people, because they're so blind, they think it's genuinely magic and they think it's part of the show. And they see nothing wrong with it. But the devil literally cuts this man's head off. And they're looking at the crowd shouting and laughing and cheering him on. And yet the peak of the show is that the devil puts the man's head back on and brings him back. And the people are absolutely bewitched by his abilities as a magician. And they completely ignore the reality of the devil showing, look at the evil that I am doing right in your face, and you humans are so ignorant towards that. He points out the irony. And often in this book specifically, the devil's character, he becomes the character revealing truth in a very dishonest society. And now this is not to confuse him as a purveyor or a bringer of truth in the sense that he is truth oriented, but he's revealing the truth in a very twisted way. And the people are so desensitized to truth and so desensitized to evil that they actually can't see. They think it's just normal. And this is a really big reflection, I think, of society today. Everyone's so desensitized to evil. Everyone is so blinded by it. And when we see truly evil things happening in our face, we don't believe it. And the best place to hide evil is in plain sight. And the devil's goal, just like it is in this book, is essentially to convince the world that he does not exist and that evil does not exist, which is why you see a lot of people now trying to say that there's no good or bad. It's all up to interpretation and subjective assignment, which is absolutely moronic. But I think that can cover The Master and Margaret. It's a great read. It's about 600 pages. It's a bit of a long one, but it's so worth the read. Absolutely incredible book. And the commentary from Behemoth is pretty funny. The talking cat is so much depth. And it shows also that the artist, the master, how art and beauty can save the world because they are window reflections to the divine. And they explain what logic cannot explain. And being able to, and that is why the master is persecuted so hard in this society, because he is trying to reveal real truth to these people. And because they're so far gone, they're so blind to it, and they call him crazy, and they try to rip up all his manuscripts and destroy his work. So that's something definitely to think and ponder about a society that allows so much corruption and then cannot see past their own. Now, the fifth book, phenomenal book. And by the way, I'm not ranking these in an order of 7 is the worst. I'm just ranking them. They're just in any order. But this, I believe, could be at the number 1 spot. And I believe that this is, a lot of people would agree in history that this is the best book or one of the best books or bits of literature ever written in all of history. It is absolutely phenomenal. And it is The Brothers Karamazov by Fyodor Dostoevsky. It is a brilliant depiction of morality and human nature. It has everything you want: philosophy, theology, psychology, all in one book, dissected to an absolute T, done with such meticulous precision. I also think that this is the only Dostoevsky book I have on the list, but since we're talking about Dostoevsky, you should read all 5 of Dostoevsky's great works: Crime and Punishment, The Brothers Karamazov, The Notes from Underground, Demons, The Idiot. All 5 of those books, if you can read all 5 of those books, you will be perfectly set view-wise, I think, and that'll give you enough to think about for 10 lifetimes, because he talks about things that you just cannot exhaust in one conversation. But I do think, and most people would regard, despite what their favorite book of the 5 is, most people would regard Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov as his crowning achievement. It's a work of art, and all his books follow a very similar theme. And for those who have read it will understand what I mean. But the core question and the thing that this book is supposed to represent for the world is the problem of evil, which is the biggest problem and the philosophical question that we've had since the dawn of time that people battle with. It's, why should humans be moral? Not how, but why? That's the more important question. That's also what I try to talk about on here, is the why, which is why I really love and resonate with Dostoevsky, because the why, he really gets into the why and really makes you think. His books are not easy to read at all, but the depth and the reflection time that you can have just thinking on these books is unparalleled to any other form of literature. The literary quality of his story and his fiction is unmatched, and it is more true than anything else you could ever read that's nonfiction. In my humble opinion, that's what as far as I can tell, that's what this book has perfectly laid out before me and before many in the history before me. So this story essentially follows 3 brothers who are struggling between and represent faith, doubt, and passion. And this is the fundamental core of human nature and us. And those are the three things we all battle with: passion, doubt, and faith. Some more than others, some less. It's a spectrum, and we lean more towards one than the others. And we have different percentage-based values for each. But basically, it follows the three sons. It follows the death of their father, the mysterious death of their father. And the three sons are Alyosha Karamazov, who is the youngest son of the three, and Dostoevsky paints him as the hero of the story, which I think is true. And the second child is Ivan Karamazov. He's the intellectual rebellion, and he is very rational, cold-hearted, decisive, driven, logically oriented, and he deals with lots of suffering as a consequence. Dmitri, the oldest brother, he is the one that represents passion and instinct. He is someone who is hedonistic, but he's also very honorable, and he fights to be virtuous, and he understands the weight of his suffering. He sins, he grieves, he repents, and then he repeats. And that is the perfect example of where we all are. I would say how I would rank them is Dmitri is the person we currently are or where we should be on a spectrum. Dmitri is the person in the middle, edging towards the top. Alyosha is at the top of this spectrum with faith and spiritual love and humility. And he is described as, he is so good of a person that he is basically an angel walking on earth. And that level of love and goodness is achievable, but it is so difficult and so hard. But Alyosha is at that end. So he is the ideal pinnacle of what we should strive to be, hopefully one day. And then Ivan is the regressed version on the opposite end, which is being in the worst possible spot, being driven so hard by rationality and utility, and only being minded in one specific way that blinds you to love, and it does not allow Ivan to love or to be loved. And as a result, he suffers so intensely in this novel. He is driven to complete madness and isolation because of that thought. And the funny thing is, Ivan, he is the smartest sibling of the three. Logically and intellectually, he is a force to be reckoned with. And Dostoevsky does this with lots of his characters who, although Ivan is not painted as a villain, but with Dostoevsky's antagonists, when they're representing bad walks in life, he represents them as the most powerful version of that evil that they can be. So instead of straw manning, he steel mans, which is why Ivan is such a compelling character. And Ivan, he makes the best points on why it's not that he doesn't believe that God doesn't exist, but he says in one of his quotes that he respectfully returns the ticket and he doesn't want to know about it because he thinks that children suffering should never justify God or heaven as a reward. It's very deep, and one of his other most famous quotes, which is amazing. And funnily enough, it's honestly a critique of his own position. But he says, without God, everything is permitted. And that's something to think about. I mean, if there's no God, if there's no morality, if there's no base, no foundational base of virtue and absolution, every single evil deed and good deed becomes relative, and everything is permitted and should not be looked down upon, which it's a fantastic quote. And often Ivan and Alyosha, when they're debating, Alyosha, he debates with love and he really represents what it's like to be an angel and to be like Christ. And Ivan is spewing out all this incredibly deep intellectual arguments that Alyosha cannot contend with because Alyosha intellectually is not the smartest, but he has the most wisdom of the three of his brothers. And knowledge and knowing and being super intellectual, when it's not integrated with meaning and love and humility and truth, you suffer as Ivan does and you're not actually wise. Ivan, he has a devastating intellect, and it makes it so hard for Alyosha to combat that. And that's the point. Dostoevsky makes the greatest argument for atheism that there ever has been. in this book, especially in the Grand Inquisitor chapter, which is a phenomenal read. But he also, in that same chapter, provides the greatest argument for faith and love, and specifically Orthodox Christianity, because he was devout himself. But the thing with Dostoevsky that most people don't know is that he suffered on both ends. He was once Dmitri, he was once Ivan, he was once Alyosha. He was the atheist, the cold-hearted rationalist. He was Dmitri, battling with passion and hedonism and intellect and lust, and battling with desire and then honor, and still, despite his evil, trying to be good, and also still striving to try be Alyosha, which it's remarkable. Best book, in my opinion. Everyone needs to read that. So the themes of that essentially is just faith versus doubt, the problem of evil, moral responsibility. Why should we continue to be good despite how much evil there is? It, I have no words explaining how, like, the vehemence of this book is unmatched. It's one to none. The mystery, another quote that Dostoevsky says in the book is, which is phenomenal, the mystery of human existence lies not just in staying alive, but in finding something to live for, which is that I think is how you deal with suffering and tragedy, because you need to find a mode of being that is so profound and powerful that it withstands tragedy and keeps your joy in the right place. Incredible. That novel just tackles such a terrifying philosophical question for most people, which is, if God does not exist, is everything permitted? And why should I follow? Amazing read. Amazing read. Because human beings, we're all Ivan, Dmitri, and Alyosha, and in our lives, we're all constantly fluctuating between the three. Some people obstinately and stubbornly remain at Ivan, but it shows that anyone can rise or fall to Dmitri, but they can also continue to strive and rise eternally to Alyosha, which is so profound. Give it a read, please. It's really good. Now, the next book, this list wouldn't be a complete list. This is book number 4. This would not be a complete list if I didn't have Hamlet and some Shakespeare. So the next book is Hamlet and the Birth of Modern Consciousness. That is what this book represents for your knowledge for the world. Now, the main question of this book is what happens when intelligence leads you to paralysis, which is such a reflection of society, and every single person here lives with that analysis paralysis. They think themselves into such a state where they cannot act morally, righteously. They're frozen by thought. And with the amount of consumption in this culture and the amount of information that we are constantly exposed to every second, frying our dopamine receptors, our attention span, our ability to think for ourselves, because all we're doing is taking in information at a rate that 100 years ago, the average person would never experience in their life. It is unparalleled in its paralysis of human mind. So the basic plot summary, I believe this is also Shakespeare's greatest play. Hamlet is phenomenal. Hamlet, King Lear are very similar stories, but I think Hamlet is just better because Hamlet is all these characters in all these books. What I want to preface is they are all truths that endure and art that endures across time. They are perennial hyper realities of modes of being and characters that live inside us, which makes them more real than the abstraction, as I've said in my other podcasts. Prince Hamlet, essentially, though, he learns that his father, the king of Denmark, was murdered by his uncle, and the uncle has taken the throne. The uncle has also taken his mother, Gertrude, so they're having a thing. And this is revealed to him in the form of his father coming and appearing to Hamlet as a ghost and saying, listen, I have done terrible things, which is why I cannot let you go and do something terrible morally, because you will be no better than I, and you have to break the cycle, essentially. He shows that he was not a good leader and he was very corrupt, and the father represents the ghost. Well, it can be Hamlet's conscience putting the pieces together and overthinking, or it's a physical representation of his guilt manifesting as the ghost of his father. And he's just revealing the absolute decay that is wrought in Denmark and what is happening with the kingdom. Hamlet, he vows to his father's ghost revenge, but he becomes trapped in endless reflection and doubt, because Hamlet is someone who's honorable and he's very intelligent and very melancholic. So he has deep analysis and thought of life. He has great depth perception, but he's also struggling so hard to commit to some kind of revenge because he knows it has to be done, but he also knows that it's going against his moral code. Unbelievable stuff. And then he becomes trapped in this endless cycle of reflection, revenge, doubt. And he's pulled between multiple ways of being because his hierarchy of priority is fragmented and he doesn't have a single clear focus. And that's a thought for you as well. If you're someone who has to overthink or has to over rationalize everything and you think of a million different ways and you become so paralyzed by that you can't act, you're in a really bad place. You know, his profound intelligence causes him to question everything, including his actions. And it just leads to, I'm not going to spoil the book, but many of the problems that come his way as he's trying to do this. He's trying to set up Claudius to his uncle to admit to the crime in a certain way. He is driven by madness and trying to kill him. It's amazing. It's great. And what he represents and what this book represents is the overthinking intellectual, closely tied to someone like Ivan Karamazov. But Hamlet is more honorable than Ivan Karamazov, and Hamlet is also more, it's not more that he's not virtuous, it's more that he doesn't know how to act without diluting the moral urgency of the situation. And these themes, they represent indecision, consciousness, existential questions, melancholy, doubt. And the famous Hamlet quote and Shakespeare quote that comes out of this book is to be or not to be. And that just represents, the danger of thinking without acting, but to be is to live, or not to be, to not live. He's saying, is it better for me to live with this torment and to do what's right, or is it better for me to die? And this is greatly bolstered in the section towards the end where he digs up Yorick's grave. And Yorick was he was a court jester that used to entertain his father when he was alive, and he used to entertain and look after Hamlet. And he digs up Yorick's skull from his grave and he holds it, and he has a massive monologue and contemplation of life, which is unmatched. And he really shows that melancholic depth and side, which allows him to go on to take the right step. And holding Yorick's skull, he recognizes to himself and he says, what are we fighting for? This is all meaningless. And not in a nihilistic sense, but the sense that we're all going to be Yorick's skull. We're all going to be dust. And why are we worrying so much about titles? Why did my uncle want to take the throne when the throne is not going to save him from death, who equalizes all? It's profound. The relevance of the skull humbling Hamlet into a better moral and virtuous lens is incredible. Many people now, in the modern times, they analyze life endlessly but never take action. And part of the ways they can do that is by remembering death, having death at the forefront of your life, but not despairing over it. And also just you just have to take action. You need to look like a fool before you can make things work. Now, the third book, this one is also a great one. This is Forced by Goethe. I'm not 100% sure how to pronounce it, but he's from Germany, and he wrote this book. He wrote Forced Part 1 and Forced Part 2. Part 2 kind of sucks, in my opinion. It's very difficult and doesn't really lead to anywhere, and it's a bit of rambling. You can still read it, and I'm sure there is something good in it, but you need a really knowledgeable person on that book to help analyze and decipher it for you, because it's so here and there that it's really hard to understand what it's really trying to do. But this represents the Faustian spirit of modern civilization. So the core question of this book is, what is the cost of limitless ambition? And we see people with hustle culture, how they're so determined to work the most hours and to be perceived as someone so virtuous because they work so hard and they sell their soul away to work, and they have an ambition that doesn't benefit the community and illumine the soul, but instead it corrodes it. So the plot overview essentially of Forced is that it's the story of a man who has achieved intellectual mastery, but he still feels spiritually empty. He's studied and mastered philosophy, science, biology, theology, all of it, and none of it satisfies him because you cannot find satisfaction through knowledge. And he makes a wager, essentially, the devil appears to him, and the devil in this story is represented, the devil's name is Mephistopheles, and the devil is tempting him, and he wishes to make a wager, and that is that if the devil can show him an experience so perfect that he wishes that moment would last forever, his soul would eternally go with the devil. So the devil grants him, but also deceptively, he grants him more knowledge. He grants him the knowledge of the spiritual and the mystical, and there is some sly references to some kind of supernatural ability as well. And the devil tries to woo him over essentially with temptation and pride and lust and that ambition without meaning. And the entire story becomes a meditation on the danger of limitless ambition, the idea that if you pursue experience, pleasure, hedonism, and knowledge without restraint and without virtue guiding every path you take, you may eventually lose your soul in the process, which is exactly what happens, because Forced, he ends up committing some really, without spoiling the book, he ends up committing a lot of really bad things that hurt a lot of innocent people. And he represents, the man who sells his soul for greatness. And we see that everywhere. People, they sell their soul for their work. They sell their soul for fame and money. And whether you take that in a literal sense or even a metaphorical sense, selling your soul, when you do that and you're giving away a part of yourself for something vain, you should always remember this, that in doing so and in making that deal with the devil, for lack of a better quote, the devil grants you things quickly, but not completely. And on the surface to Force, it looks like he has everything and he understands and he's so mesmerized by what's being granted to him. But the devil never grants you anything fully. And there is a catch, and that catch was his soul going with the devil for eternity to hell. And basically, essentially, the devil won because you can't outwit the marionette of pride himself. And he is a trickster and he manipulates. And the people who live their life of vanity and knowledge and being the smartest and value IQ and intelligence and titles and I'm better than you and I'm smarter than you, therefore I'm worth more. The people who live life that way and get lots of money and are rich and orient themselves in that negative way, they are still hollow inside and they have spiritual emptiness, and they think that achieving all that greatness will solve that, but it does the complete opposite and it does not save them. So the themes of that are the ambition and the temptation, the pursuit of knowledge and the dangers of that. He says in the book, there's a quote, he says, "Two souls, alas, are dwelling in my breast." And that is now, there's a lot of different ways you can interpret that quote, but one is now that he's allowed the devil to grip his soul and he is torn between the evil and the good, and he leans more into the evil because when the devil is holding your soul in his grasp, it is really hard to slip out of that. And you're definitely not going to slip out by going into pleasure and hedonism. Force represents humanity's endless striving. That's what I want you to walk away with, to remember. And the striving that does not benefit society and the community, but descends you straight down to hell and to madness. Book number 2, a masterpiece at work, Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. This is trying to explain to people man playing God. Absolutely phenomenal, absolutely phenomenal. The core question of this is, what responsibilities come with creation? And the overview of that is Victor Frankenstein. A lot of people get confused. Frankenstein is not the monster that's created. Frankenstein is the scientist. It's his name, Victor Frankenstein. And when people say Frankenstein is the monster, it's like, yes, he is. The scientist is a monster. He's more monster than the monster he created. But for the sake of clarification, Frankenstein is the scientist and not the monster when you're going by name specifically. Now, Victor Frankenstein, he becomes obsessed with discovering the secret of life and creating life. And he's very similar to Force, where he's so intelligent, he's mastered all these fields, and his ambition is so high that he wants to essentially be God. Now, he does this successfully, unfortunately, unbeknownst to his knowledge, but through multiple experiments and convincing, he creates a living being and a monster from dead matter. And he gets warned a million times by people that, no, this is wrong. We're not meant to create life. And this, what you're doing it's madness. It's sorcery. It's heretical. And sorcery, not in the sense of magic, but sorcery in the sense of contending with dark spirits and forces. Now, through his experiments, he creates that living being, and he is horrified by the creature and he abandons it. I wonder what kind of consequences that will brew, creating life and then abandoning it. This creature is intelligent. It is beyond the normal human peak of strength and speed. It is it's almost like a super soldier of a person, just better in every way. But it's rejected by humanity, and it becomes bitter and dangerous as a result, because it's like, well, it learns to read and understand by analyzing human behavior. And it says to itself, I wasn't brought into this life. I didn't get to choose. And now I've been abandoned and I'm persecuted by everyone. Everyone hates me. And well, I mean, fair enough. Why would you not be angry with that? I would be angry, and I think most people would. And he represents the creator who refuses responsibility. And those themes amongst that the book deals with is scientific ambition, overweighing meaning and the divine, and loneliness and rejection, responsibility for creation. It's a big take on the lack of responsibility that Victor doesn't have a hold on. The funny thing with this is that it's also a reflection of the scientific ambition, but the development of technology, or the development of the scientific movement without an established ethical and moral framework in place to humble it and keep it in check. And because he doesn't have that framework, he equates himself to equal levels of God. But the thing is, he wants God's power to create, but he doesn't want God's heart and responsibility to love and to nurture and to care for the being that he created. And he created a monster of himself. And the monster and Victor, they represent each other. They're just mirrors. They show each other the monster and the calling for something greater. A really good quote from Frankenstein is, I ought, and this is the monster, he says, I ought to be thy Adam, but I am rather the fallen angel, which is, wow, that's a hell of a thing to think about. And the reason why is because the monster was created. He should have been created to be like Adam, to be loved, the first of all creation, to be loved and looked after as God did with Adam. But rather, he's the fallen angel and he's Satan, who got kicked out and rejected. And as a result now, the tragedy of the monster is that he was not born evil, but he became monstrous through the rejection and loneliness and not the love. Now, a funny parallel is most people call the Frankenstein book, and it says it on the book as well. It's Frankenstein is the modern Prometheus. Prometheus is a Greek mythological titan who steals fire from the gods, which the fire is supposed to represent knowledge, enlightenment, and technology, and he gives it to the people. And as a result, he is punished for all eternity, chained to a rock where an eagle pecks at his liver every single day for all eternity. Now, the parallel to that is, and I found a really interesting parallel, is the parallel between Prometheus, Satan, and Victor, but they're different. Victor aligns more with Satan because the three of these people are trying to represent bringers of light and illumination. But you have to ask yourself, illumination to what end? Okay, so in this, Satan and Victor share that pride where they want to be equal to God and they want to push past the ambition, and they're rooted and driven by pride. And as we all know, pride comes before a fall. But the question they never asked themselves was, are they prepared to fall? And in that overreach to try and be God, but not have God's heart, they fell and they suffered. And Victor and Satan suffered greatly. But the thing is now, the parallel to that is Prometheus. He did the same thing, except his was a noble sacrifice. He believed that the humans should have fire. They should have that technology to help the human race develop, and they should have that knowledge. And in the context of the story, they should have. And Prometheus did the right thing. He sacrificed himself for the greater good of the community. Even though he would never get to experience it himself, he still sacrificed himself so that the others could live a better life. That is an example of where the overreach and the sacrifice, he's taken responsibility to make the greatest sacrifice of himself for the benefit of others. And that's very similar also to Moses from the Old Testament. Moses, he never entered the promised land, but he paved the way for the rest of the people. He made the ultimate sacrifice so that the community could benefit. That is the example of the overreach and the ambition that's good versus the overreach and the ambition that's bad and rooted by pride and not by responsibility and love and sacrifice. Victor and Satan were led by pride and therefore had the greatest fall of all. Phenomenal read, incredible read. Please go read it. There's also the new Netflix movie on it, which I thought the Netflix movie was awesome and it did a few things different, but it has some really, really incredible scenes that I think the change was awesome in comparison to the book. Still read the book. The book's iconic. And this is a lesson to you that don't put your intellect and your ambition over what's right and what's true and what's good, because you fall into that. You fall into that suffering and trying to play God is never going to end up well because you don't have the heart. You don't have the omnipotence of God. Victor, instead of stealing fire like Prometheus did, Victor stole the omnipotence of God, which is God's infinite strength to create life. He didn't take God's eternal love, which is why he suffered, and which is why people who fall down that same route, well, they're not animating corpses from the dead and bringing them to life, but that drive. And there's a good parallel in here, which is with the development of AI, where if it's rendered and tempered with a good heart and with an ethical framework, it can be very beneficial and help. But the people making it are making it. And I mean, if they don't have a good ethical framework, this AI could get exceptionally out of hand, and this AI could represent exactly Frankenstein's monster. And it could become autonomous and lash back at its creators, which is scary. You know, there's exceptional parallels to people trying to play God and to create something so powerful without an ethical integration and framework of love and responsibility. And finally, getting to the last book, The Picture of Dorian Gray. Absolutely remarkable. This deals with another question that is gone from society, which is beauty without morality. Now, it's essentially trying to get at what happens when someone pursues beauty and pleasure without morality. So the overview of the story is Dorian Gray is a beautiful young man. He's charismatic, he is extroverted, he is charming. He's a very, very good looking man in the context of the book. And he's obsessed with his youth and his beauty, and he wishes to sustain his pleasure forever. So right there, that already tells us that he's immature, because people who are immature cling to pleasure and hedonism and they don't grow up and adopt a responsibility. So he is essentially a child in an adult's body. Moving on, after having his portrait painted, He mysteriously remains physically young while the painting ages and reflects the corruption of his soul. So he asks this man to paint a portrait of him, and in that painting, he is selling his soul essentially for eternal youth, which doesn't come without consequences, as I said, with the whole forced discussion, forced book. But the painter could represent the devil in a sense, but I don't think that's the main representation of what it is. It's more so the selling of the soul. And as Dorian pursues pleasure without restraint, each time he pursues that sin and that pleasure and that hedonism, the portrait becomes increasingly grotesque. And every time he sees it, the portrait is supposed to represent his soul. So he's sold his soul into that painting, and now he's hollow and his soul is rotting away and it's decaying and he looks like a zombie, and bits of him are falling off and skin's melting from his body because he is perfect and clean on the outside. And he holds this prestigious mask of vanity, yet his soul is rotten and it causes him to become extremely narcissistic and manipulative and Machiavellian-like and psychopathic and sadistic. And he commits all these atrocities against all people because he gets to live for the thrill of the pleasure. And I mean, he has no compass for morality, obviously. So he falls into all these evil. The deeper point of it, though, is that it isn't that beauty is evil. Beauty is necessary, and the importance of beauty, I've spoken multiple times, is unparalleled because it's a window into the divine. It connects us with humans, and it explains things that logic cannot, and it touches our soul and speaks to us in a way like nothing else. But beauty, while being that tango with the divine and that wrestling with the divine, without morality and integration, humility and love, it becomes corruption. Because beauty is supposed to elevate the soul to the divine. It's supposed to inspire virtue and art and reverence for life and to see the beauty in all things. But when beauty becomes detached from truth and goodness, it turns into vanity and decadence. So Dorian doesn't just love beauty, he worships it. And this is one of those things which I have spoken about. A good thing becoming an idol becomes a bad thing. So beauty is an extraordinarily beneficial thing. And we've lost our perception for beauty in the world we live in and people now because, well, there's a lot of reasons which I won't get into today for another video, but the novel shows what happens when aesthetic pleasure becomes your religion, essentially. They take the good thing, they idolize it, and when something like that becomes an idol, it always twists and is turned and corrupted into the worst version of itself. Because beauty, it should illuminate the soul to the awareness of the divine, not replace it. Art gives form to what cannot be logically expressed, but when it's overruled by and becomes an idol, it becomes that tyrannical spirit of malevolence that takes hold of your life. And your soul is the cost for that. Your corrupted soul, your decayed soul, that is the result. It is the result of chasing hedonism. And I mean, wow, we live in a society now that's consumed by people who spend all day watching porn and binging alcohol and drugs and short-term mating options, casual sex. The list goes on. And these people think there's nothing wrong because it's a pleasure and I should enjoy it. And there's no consequence of living in that way, but there is incredible consequences and everyone knows this and no one wants to admit it. And the people that are ignorant towards that, they're unfortunately, the truth is they're just immature people. They're children in adults' bodies. And the reason they don't get out of that and they don't grow up is because they don't adopt responsibility, and responsibility that's so great that they don't have time for pleasure and hedonism. So that'll give you something to think about. A really good quote from The Picture of Dorian Gray is, I can't remember word for word, but it's the books that show the world, the books that the world considers immoral are the books that reflect the world's own shame, which I think is right because everyone's so sanctimonious in saying that's right and that's immoral and unlawful and you shouldn't do that because it's not righteous. You shouldn't murder people and you shouldn't do that. But when we have books and media that reflect this, it shows the world its own shame, and people are just blind to that. They want to be sanctimonious about it, but they don't want to feel the shame of it. He also says as well, the only way to get rid of temptation is to yield to it. And I don't believe that's right. But to yield to it in a way where you're accepting that temptation will be something you'll deal with to your last breath, and you should always expect temptation, but not yield to it in the sense that you should give it power over you. But you should accept that it is a part of you, and you need to take the following steps to tame it in some way. And that includes adopting the responsibility and the salvation of your soul, and the restoration of the fragmentation of your soul. And I mean, the picture of Dorian Gray perfectly shows the dangers of people who live only for pleasure and image. And well, we see that every day now with social media obsession, with the appearance and status. People want to live for vanity. They want to live a double life, and they want people to see how great they are. And wow, look at me. Look at my status. Look at my image. I'm more worthy than you. And they do it for pleasure and they do it for dopamine, but it doesn't sustain. And when tragedy comes along and wipes it away, they become narcissistic and bitter and Machiavellian, and they exploit others for their own gain, and they abuse social status as narcissists do that they have not earned themselves. It spirals completely down into those layers of hell that the Divine Comedy talks about, which is incredible. All these books connect with each other, and all these books, if you study them, read them deeply, they will answer pretty much every single question you have about life, why living in certain ways are wrong, and why you should chase after something else. As well, there's plenty of great books out there, but I think these 7, for the average person who doesn't like to read, if you can read them, it'll be a really good guide for you. Now, the big idea now I just want to end with is that these stories endure because they reveal something timeless about human nature, and that is why they are hyper realities and meta truths, because they are more real than the thing from which they are abstracted from. They're like numbers, which I've said before, and people deny that. But morality, the archetype morality is with the Karamazovs, doubt is with Hamlet, ambition is with Faust, creation with Frankenstein, vanity with Dorian Gray. It's all there. It's all there. And great literature, it doesn't simply entertain, although it is for entertainment, but it forces us to confront the deepest parts of ourselves, understand why it's wrong, and understand why we need to act better, understanding and explaining how to do it and why you should do it. And that's not what self-help does. Modern self-help is crap, as I said in my last podcast episode, because it keeps you in that state of Dorian Gray where you're only obsessed with yourself and you're narcissistic and you chase vanity thinking that that's going to better you. It's terrible. So these books, they're not stories. They're those hyper realities, those meta truths. And yes, Hamlet and Dorian Gray and Faust and Mephistopheles and whoever else, they're not physically real, but the pattern of their characters and the pattern that people fall into, Frankenstein's monster, they are all within us. And the directional path we take, if I take the path of Victor Frankenstein, I'm going to suffer the same consequences. And that is an artistic truth. That is true because it is a primordial present and future truth. It is a truth that transcends across time, and a truth that transcends across time and across culture indefinitely and eternally is a truth. And these are all those truths. They're psychological and philosophical and metaphorical and symbolical and metaphysical and archetypical and spiritual maps of the human condition. And everyone needs to train themselves in this because we've lost that ability to see. We've lost that ability to nurture that eye for the divine and that eye for artistic beauty and truth. Unbelievable stuff. It's truly mind-boggling. And I'm so passionate about this because now in a world that's super rational and logically minded, all these books, funnily enough, they all explain that truth far better than any of that rationale can, because when things are just reduced to what's calculable and utility, everything else goes out the window and you become forced, or you become Hamlet, or you become Victor Frankenstein. You try to play God, even though you don't believe in him, or your ambition corrupts your soul, as Dorian Gray does. You suffer torment and madness like Ivan Karamazov, or you can follow the way and you can become Alyosha and redeem yourself and fight to be the right person and do the right things. They show us the consequences of pride, ambition, beauty, doubt, faith, temptation, and it's all in there. In other words, to put it simply to close, they teach us what it means to be human. So I'm going to leave it there for you guys today. This was a big episode and a big one to think of. I thank you guys so much for tuning into this. Please get yourself a copy of these books. If you can, get the Penguins Classics version of these books, because they're generally the best translations for a lot of these books. And get reading. Fix your life. Read these books. Let it help you and pull you out of the rut that you're in and your confusion and disorientation. Allow these books to channel it into a singular orientation and hierarchy of priority that benefits the soul and the community and allows your spirit to transcend to the divine. Thank you guys so much for watching. Love.